Very good question, and I would say, partly this is based. It's actually based more on what I've read, and I've read extensively, and partly on my own experience. I probably rely more on medication, although there are plenty of people who are far more heavily medicated than I am, than I would ideally like to, given what I know about medication. What the cutting edge research, which is piling up rapidly, suggests is that, and there are many forms of psychotherapy that work different ways for different people, but cognitive behavioral therapy, which is basically sort of a mixture of exposure therapy, exposing yourself to the things that you fear the most in order to withstand that and feel the anxiety diminish, and then doing what the therapists call kind of cognitive retraining, or reframing your cognition so that you realize these are irrational. That has been proven to be highly, highly effective for not just anxiety, but a whole bunch of other things, ranging from depression to schizophrenia. And my kids, who I have the misfortune of inheriting my anxious genes, started developing some of the same phobias at age 6 and 7 that I had. And I didn't go into therapy until I was 10. We put them in when they were 6 and 7. It made a huge difference. I mean, knock on wood. And the joke in my family is that my daughter, who's now 11, is actually much less anxious and better able to handle her anxiety, and she's totally unmedicated, than I am, due purely to cognitive behavioral therapy. The other thing where there is all kinds of emerging research, both from neuroscience, and this is drawing from Eastern sort of medical practices, is mindfulness meditation. And this is sort of, in a simple-minded way, so you're just being present in the moment, doing deep breathing. But there are these fascinating studies, and I've dabbled in this a little bit, and I haven't gotten good enough at it. And of course, the irony is that the people who most would benefit from this are the ones who have the greatest challenge in sitting still long enough. There's a great book by Dan Harris, who you probably know is on ABC, his experiences with it. But basically, there's fascinating studies that show taking people who are completely novice meditators, and you take a control, them in a control group, and the ones who, over a period of just, I forget if it's 4 or 18 weeks, of practicing meditating, they self-report higher levels of well-being, lower levels of anxiety and depression, and then you put them in a brain scan in an MRI machine, and they actually, their amygdala, which is sort of the seat of fear in your brain, has shrunk, and the density of matter in their frontal cortex, which is the rational part, has increased. So this is like a literal manifestation of mind over matter. So the cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness meditation are the two kind of cutting edge things that I think will be the emerging treatments of choice for a long time.
You make an interesting connection in the book that there was a time when you don't hear about this. People were just trying to survive. And then we get through the Industrial Revolution, we get into modern times, we get into a society where you can come from a poor family but end up rich, like the possibility of advancement. And you kind of ask the question, does this make us anxious? Before, nothing to worry about. You're going to be what your grandfather was, what his grandfather was. But does life make us anxious now in this society in a way that it didn't before?
Yes. Although it's complicated. I mean, I was fascinated, so I thought that would be my conclusion going in, and it kind of ended up being my conclusion coming out. But it got complicated along the way, because as you look back through every era of modern and ancient history, so now the 1950s, the Gilded Age, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the late Roman Empire, the 4th century BC Greek Empire, every single historical era that has any kind of intellectual vibrancy to it believes itself to be the most anxious era ever, and that includes our own. So in some ways, again, this gets back to anxiety is clearly woven into the human condition, and every era has this. That said, I do think that eras like the ones I just mentioned, including our own, are more the structure of society and the economy do produce more anxiety. And so, as you were alluding to, if you were born, if any of us were born in the Middle Ages, our lives probably, not just probably, almost certainly in some, material bottom line sense would have sucked more than they do now. We would be more likely to die of some horrible disease in infancy or at an early age. You are born, you have no political freedom. You're born into the role that you're going to inhabit for the rest of your life. You're probably, if you're in Europe, I found this quote that most priests believed that your odds of damnation were 10,000 to 1 in favor of damnation. So you had a pretty dim view of life, and your life was probably not very happy. On the other hand, you probably weren't neurotically anxious in the sense that we are now, because you had no freedom of choice. And that even though, net, the benefits of advancing political freedom, economic well-being have been, as I say, net goods, you now have to decide, where do I want to go to college? Do I want to be a lawyer or an actor? Do I want to be, what's my personal style? Am I goth or am I preppy? Do I want to be a stay-at-home mom or not? And this is a trivial example, but you walk into the grocery store and there are 57 kinds of cereal. That's great, except there's evidence, Barry Schwartz, who's a psychologist at Swarthmore, talks about, every time you have to make that decision, it depletes your sort of brain energy a little bit. So that, the benefits of modern society and political liberty and economic progress, none of which we would want to trade away, because otherwise we would have pellagra and scurvy and probably most of us would be dead by now. They have produced increased anxiety because of just uncertainty. And I guess that's the final point, is that there's a lot of evidence that uncertainty, particularly for people with general anxiety disorder, literally like rewires your brain to become progressively more anxious. And we live in an age where, obviously the last, at this point, 8 years have been economically stressful. But even going back to the Industrial Revolution, capitalism is stressful because you have to be worried about, are you rising or failing? Status becomes a huge thing. This may be rewiring our brains to be more anxious. There's a primatologist and neuroscientist at Stanford who's brilliant, named Robert Sapolsky, who talks about how one of the great curses in American history was in human history, going from sort of pre-agricultural times when we were all just sort of nomads and there was no sort of social structure, to agriculture when you could sort of hoard assets in the form of agriculture, and we became socially stratified, and that became a huge source of stress. And if we were all back in the state of nature wandering around, we'd be worrying about getting eaten by a tiger, but you're not worried about, am I keeping up with the Joneses or the Edwardses?
Trust me, the Edwardses are thinking about who they're keeping up with.
Yeah.
Everybody's stressed. We have about 5 minutes before we're going to open the floor to your questions. 2 quick questions. You talk a bit about nature versus nurture. Your mom was very much a worrier, and your childhood psychologist thinks a lot's related to that. Your dad had some issues. In fact, as the son of people who fled the Holocaust, you showed studies that seemed to stay with people down through generations.
Yeah.
You send off some things to 23andMe to get your genome coded, and it made me wonder, do you think the day is coming when they will figure out genes for anxiety and try in the womb to undo those genes for people?
I mean, I think probably yes, in some form, yes. And I have some misgivings about that, because I do think that even as, and I talk about this in the book, I mean, there are now hundreds, if not thousands, of genetic studies every year trying to identify, the specific, the Woody Allen gene that makes you neurotic, or the constellation of genes, and that you now can identify this from the moment of more or less conception. Which is a dangerous thing, because you end up creating designer babies and things like that. And one important point, I mean, and again, as always, my views on this are sort of somewhat complex. I do think, based on my looking back at my own family history and reading the research, that genetics, kind of is at the base of the pyramid. And if we were all sort of born with a set of genes that predispose us to be either more or less physiologically reactive to stress, we exist along a spectrum. That's a powerful thing, and you're sort of born with that. That said, genes, and this is something I wrestle with my Dr. W, and I talk about some of these conversations in the book. He was always saying, no, genes are not destiny. I talk in the book about my great-grandfather, who was a very successful man, but in his 50s was overcome by anxiety and ended up intermittently institutionalized for the sort of last 30 or 40 years of his life, had electroshock therapy. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got, his genes, I'm going to end up the same way. And my Dr. W would say, first of all, you only have like 1/8 of his genes. Second of all, he didn't have access to modern psychopharmacology. And second of all, genes are not destiny. Biology is not destiny. So even if it is the case that you start to be able to tinker with these things very early on, there are always ways, and the military is looking into this. Psychologists these days talk about cultivating resilience, and resilience is a sort of term of art for resistance to anxiety or ability to bounce back from traumatic experiences. You can learn that no matter what your genome is. So I would always caution against, sort of complete genetic determinism, even though I do think that genes have a powerful driving, factor in determining what yours or mine or any of your levels of anxiety are.
Finally, in the book, this is not easy for your wife. At your wedding, everybody was looking at you, almost passed out. At the birth of your child, everybody was looking at you. And she sounds like an incredible lady. But she says to you, I don't know that I would want you to not have this, because it sounds as though it gives you a great wealth of empathy and concern for other people. And she says, if you didn't have that, that makes part of what makes me love you. But Dr. W says to you at the end of the book, this is not over. Like, he thinks he's going to win on this with you. To your wife's point, do you want him to win? Do you think he can win? And do you want him to win?
98% of me says yes. I mean, the idea that I could wake up in the morning without whatever on any given day, some amount of dread, if I could avoid the panic attacks that debilitate me and make me miserable, if I could travel, I've turned down journalistic trips to China or Mexico because of my constellation of fears. It seems like it would be a complete liberation. But I do wonder, and having done the research, there are certain things that are not necessarily the anxiety itself, but maybe correlated with it, an ability to have sort of social perceptiveness that makes me attuned to other people that maybe I would lose if I were less anxious. Things like that. I mean, there's a lot of studies that I cite in the book. There's a study, can warriors be winners? There are some research that suggests that, like, the crash of 2008 would not have happened if you'd had slightly more anxious money managers. These were all highly risk-tolerant people, and they were like, yeah, whatever. There are ways in which, and I believe this in my own, that overconfidence is a bad thing. Worrying makes you more conscientious. There are many ways in which. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. If I could be suddenly, if you give me a pill that would cure me of my anxiety forever, I think I would take it. It was funny. I was at some event many months ago, and related to the book, and one of my colleagues, Hannah Rosen, who's very outspoken and not afraid to be blunt, came up to my wife and said, "What do you get out of this? Why are you still?" And my wife, taken aback, was like, well, sometimes he's kind of funny, which is probably a sort of unsatisfactory answer. But it's I think my wife's real fear is that, like, the far side of acute anxiety is probably complete psychopathy, where you have no anxiety and maybe you're a complete jerk. To the extent I would probably be, that's the trade-off that I think maybe I'd be nervous making. But if I could be sort of completely denuded of my anxiety and not have an injection of additional jerkitude, I would take that.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed the book, and I
thank you so
learned a
much.
lot.
Appreciate it.
Now it's an opportunity for those of you out there who may have some questions. Let's get started with this gentleman here in the blue turtleneck.
Thank you. This is loud. Talk about anxiety. I work at a local college, and I counsel college students. And one of the things I find very inspiring is how you were able to get into journalism and stay persistent with this. And I guess my question is, how were you able to realize this is what you wanted to do and stick with it, with anxiety and knowing how to, all the stuff that comes with that? Thank you.
No, good that question. That's one I get a fair amount, because people say, why would you go into, and you can relate to this, why would you go into journalism? It's full of deadlines, and maybe I would be better off being, a penguin keeper at the zoo or something. Not that that's not a stressful job. I don't know. They probably have to get fed like at weird hours, and I actually don't know. I kind of drifted into it. I always, as an undergraduate, I was an English major, did a little bit of journalism, was always a heavy reader, was always very, very intellectually curious, was always easily bored, which may have something to do. I've never been diagnosed with ADD, but maybe I have it. But I liked, being a liberal arts major as an undergraduate, because you could pursue your curiosities where they took you. And so that's sort of what attracted me to journalism. And then it's interesting. I've talked. So when the book first came out, I had a number of journalists interviewing me for newspaper articles and stuff. And a lot of them, they'd do the interview, and then they'd confess. And I think it wasn't a coincidence that they were the ones who had chosen this assignment. They'd be like, actually, like, I suffer from really bad anxiety myself, but I don't when I'm in my journalist mode. If I'm these people would say to me, if I'm in a sort of amorphous social situation, and I'm talking to people, I'm adrift and I don't know what to say. But if I'm kind of wearing my metaphorical journalist hat and I have a notebook in my hand, I'm totally fearless and I'll ask anything. So I think there's something about inhabiting that journalist role where you suddenly have carte blanche to be asking impertinent questions and to be pursuing your curiosity that kind of takes you out of yourself. And I think there is a narcissistic quality of self-obsession, which is one of the things that my wife most hates about my anxiety, that journalism kind of takes you out of. And I think it's not a coincidence that I ended up in what used to be monthly journalism. I work for a monthly magazine. Of course, now we're a website and daily, and the stress levels increase. But that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Do you get lost when you're writing? Like, that's a place where you don't have time to think about?
When it's going well, there's nothing more satisfying. When it's going poorly, there's nothing that makes you feel more like you're a failure who should not be on this earth.
Yeah. No, I totally identify with what you're saying. If you ever watch me do breaking news, you'll notice there's a pin in my right hand the whole time.
It's the magic pen.
It's my crutch. I have to have my pen. Back there.
I'm curious, you talked a little bit about some of the maladaptive coping mechanisms you use with anxiety. You fake a phone call, you lie about what's going on. You also talked about some of the positive sides of it. I'm curious, for people who suffer from anxiety specifically, but I think any number of disorders, how do you feel that we develop more positive coping mechanisms and sometimes, like you mentioned, use our anxiety to sort of become successful, to find our role, to really, like you said, if people managing our finances were a little bit more anxious, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are.
No, good question. And one sort of central tenet of almost all, if you talk to any anxiety clinician who treats people with anxiety, they say run toward the fear, confront the thing that you fear the most, whether it's spiders or heights or public speaking or what. And so, and it's really, really hard to do, and particularly with kids who have like school phobia. Both as a kid who went through this and was like, cried and screamed and literally had to be physically peeled away from my parents in order to go to school as late as like 6th and 7th grade. And as a parent who, when my daughter, it breaks your heart that she's so miserable, and you want to just say, no, come home, be safe, I don't want to make you unplug. You need to push them to do that. And the act of exposing yourself to your fears not only builds resistance to the fears, but builds a kind of resilience that is more generalizable than just the resistance to those fears, and that helps you develop kind of positive coping skills. And then there are other kinds of, I think people, like I was talking about mindfulness meditation, but also deep breathing exercises. If you can get really good at these things, and I wish I were better at them myself, but they're the kinds of things that you can use in life more generally. And basically, again, to go back to resilience, cultivating resilience. I mean, the Pentagon is studying how can they make their soldiers more resilient. This is a bit of a digression that goes back to genes and stuff, but one of the most fascinating things I came across, bits of research I came across in working on the book, was there is everyone talks about serotonin, which is what the most common antidepressants address, Prozac and that ilk, the SSRIs. But there's a neurotransmitter called neuropeptide Y, or NPY. And there's a researcher at Yale named Andy Morgan, and he actually studied Navy SEALs and Army Rangers who are, not anxious on average, and they, in order to graduate to becoming full-blown Navy SEALs or Army Rangers, they have to go what's called the SEER test, which is like survival, evasion, something and something else, and they're subjected to sleep deprivation and starvation and borderline torture techniques and incredible physical hardship. And what was fascinating to me, and I think to a lot of the researchers, was that so Andy would take a blood test from them in advance, and he could predict in advance, based on the level of neuropeptide Y that they had in their bloodstream, how they would perform on the test. That this one neurotransmitter, neuropeptide Y, was directly correlated with resilience and ability to perform well on this test. Now, there's other research that suggests that that is partly genetically conferred. You're born with a complement of neuropeptide Y. But there's a whole bunch of other emerging research that suggests that as you cultivate resilience, you can boost your levels of neuropeptide Y. And so, for all of us, if we can, through whatever technique, exposure, practice, mindfulness, boost our levels of neuropeptide Y, we become more resilient, and literally our physiology changes in a way that makes us more like Army Rangers. Not that we're going to go out and kill Osama bin Laden, but in ways that probably make us more effective and more confident human beings.
Right here.
How do you react to events outside yourself, like the barbarity of ISIS? Does that make you more anxious, or?
Interesting question. I've, for professional reasons, I've had to watch some of those videos, and they are absolutely horrifying and make you despair of kind of, humanity. Weirdly, and I think this is a function of my anxiety, I think, and I've talked to colleagues about this who don't have anxiety disorders. I can watch those, and they are, make me physically sick and mildly anxious, but they don't bother me as much as they bother some of my other colleagues. And to sort of make a weird connection, again, to some of the research that I came across from my book, during World War II, when England was being blitzed by V-2 rockets and the Luftwaffe from Germany, there's actually all this evidence that people who had previously been diagnosed as neurotic and anxious, their levels of anxiety went down. And partly, and there are a few theories for this. Partly was that, like, when everyone else naturally was like acting terrified in response to bombs raining down on London, they felt less compelled to try to hide their own anxiety, because it's natural to be nervous if bombs are being rained on your head. But also, it's like when there's something real to be afraid of, as opposed to sort of like irrational, neurotic things, you're actually better equipped to deal with them. And I actually think that one of the things that's best served me in my professional life is that when things are, and this isn't always true, there are times when real stressors overwhelm me and I'm not at my optimal best. But there are other times when real stress I'm actually better able to cope with than stupid, irrational stress, which is crazy. So weirdly, the answer is no, that doesn't elevate my level of anxiety. And I think for probably some people with anxiety disorder, it does. For me, in a weird way, maybe my anxiety disorder makes me better able to equipped to deal with it. So.
Well, there's a story you tell in the book about the Jewish resistance fighter.
Yeah.
Who is scared of dogs. He won't leave his house because they're dogs. When the Nazis show up, he's fine. They're going to kill him. No big deal. He just doesn't want to deal with the dog next door. And for some reason, his anxiety is bigger in his mind than the very thing he's resisting.
Exactly. Now, this is a book called The Parnassus by Silvia Arretti, which is an account of this guy was an Italian guy in Pisa who later became a prominent American psychiatrist. And he writes this account of this, as you say, sort of Jewish leader in Pisa, and he had an acute phobia. I think he had OCD and acute phobias. He was terrified of dogs. He couldn't deal with them, and so bombs are raining down on Pisa because the Germans are bombing it, and most people are leaving. He won't leave because he's afraid to leave his house, and everyone's saying, like, you're so courageous, and he's like, no, I'd rather be killed by a bomb than have to go 100 yards from my house. And then Nazis show up at the door, and they're like, we're going to kill you. And he's like, whatever, do your best. And he ended up becoming this sort of moral hero to a lot of the people in that Jewish community, because he kept telling them, I'm not super courageous. I'm not, impervious to fear of my own death. It's just I'm more afraid of dogs than I am of being killed by Nazis. But it had the effect of making him appear to be this incredibly heroic, courageous figure. And in some, incredibly limited way, I think there's a similar dynamic at work in my own thinking. So
we've got a couple of questions in the back. The lady in green and then the lady in black.
Hello. I was wondering, is there a high correlation between anxiety and shyness? Because I would think one of the ways shyness manifests itself would be in just being anxious in various social situations.
Yes, absolutely. And there is, so anxiety disorders are sort of, according to the American Psychiatric Association, broken down to a bunch of subcategories of specific anxiety disorders, one of which is social anxiety disorder, which didn't exist before 1980, and it is somewhat controversial because some people say there's no such thing as social anxiety disorder, it's just a human temperament or human trait called shyness. But yes, I mean, people, I know this from my own life, from people I've talked to, from research, for whatever combination of genetic and other reasons, there is a correlation between shyness and particularly social anxiety disorder, which can be crippling for people who have it severely, and other forms of anxiety. But weirdly, you can be very, very anxious along the spectrum of social anxiety disorder and be incredibly shy and yet be extremely physically brave, or have no other fears. So it's what's interesting about anxiety is that they sort of are really kind of broken down into subcategories that don't necessarily overlap. But the short answer is yes. And there are plenty of people for whom social anxiety disorder is so crippling that they can't get, that they have trouble finding romantic partners. They, water cooler conversation is sort of so excruciating to them that they literally cannot deal with it. And to people who don't have it, they don't understand that. I mean, of course, everyone feels a little, or many people feel a little uncomfortable, say, walking into a cocktail party where you have to make awkward small talk. For these people, like, every moment of their life is like that. And my sister, who's, very smart, talks about what she calls her talking problem, and she gets into a social situation and her brain just freezes. She can't think. And that's, I think, very common for people who have social anxiety disorder, and it does correlate with shyness.
And then there was a lady in black.
Thank you. Great talk. That was really interesting. When you were talking about your kids having anxiety, I was wondering, compared to your experience as a young child going to therapy and getting treatment, whether you think the experience of therapy and the stigma around it has changed in that period of time.
Yes, and not enough. As I think I alluded at the beginning, and partly this was my own mother's waspy upbringing. Whenever I was anxious and crying, she'd run around and close all the windows to our house because we couldn't, it couldn't be known to the neighbors that I was anxious about anything. And she always told me, don't ever admit you'll never get a job. No one will ever take you seriously. People will think you're crazy. You'll get institutionalized. And this is 35 years ago. And so there is a big difference in that I think it's much more accepted that various forms of, whether it's anxiety disorder or depression or bipolar disorder or other things, ADD, are medical conditions that have underlying physiological bases in the brain the way that diabetes or gout or strep throat do. And so it's much more acceptable to seek medical assistance, even if that medical assistance is in the form of psychotherapy. But there still is stigma. And it's complicated because, and I, even though I consider myself a kind of champion of reducing the stigma associated with seeking that out, particularly for kids, like who, if you can help kids by getting them to psychotherapy when they're 6 or 8 or 10, and make their lives that much better, like, by all means, you should. I'll come back to that in a second because there's really compelling evidence about that. But at the same time, it's a squishy area because unlike diabetes, where it's purely, a matter of kidney function or pancreatic function, your brain is yourself, and that gets into matters of character. And, if you wholly give anxiety disorders over to, a matter of medical condition? Are you giving up on the idea of character and force of will? And so it's not completely straightforward. But what I will say is, again, that there's a research at Harvard that's based on like thousands of data points by, and I'm blanking on the researcher's name, but basically, and this was incredibly compelling to me and sort of influential in getting me to seek therapy for my kids earlier rather than later. That, and I tell this story, and it terrifies some people because it means if their 5-year-old has a fear of dogs, they think, oh my God, my daughter is doomed to a life of anxiety disorders. That is not the case. However, fear of dogs at age, say, 4 is correlated with, separation anxiety at age 6, which makes you that much more likely to develop social anxiety at age 12 or 15, which makes you that much more likely to develop panic disorder in your teens and early 20s, which makes you incredibly more likely, 6 or 7 times more likely than average, to end up drug addicted and homeless at age 25 than you otherwise would be. Now again, this doesn't mean that just because your kid has a fear of dogs at age 4 that they're going to end up drug addicted and homeless at age 25. What it does mean is that there is some kind of correlation there, and that intervening early can make a huge difference in kind of changing the trajectory of that kid's life. And the insidious thing about anxiety disorders is that the kids who have ADD or oppositional defiant disorder, where they're acting out in class, those kids will get intervention because they're being problems. The anxious kid is sitting very quietly in the back, not bothering anybody, but just terrified and silent, and from the teacher's perspective, they're no problem. So identifying those kids and getting them help early, I think, is incredibly important.
Very quickly before we get to the last question, in the book, because you didn't think it was going to be published, you're very honest about your family. And there's a scene where your dad comes in, you're 14, he can't take your screaming panic attacks, and he starts punching you while your mom just is standing by. Has there had to be sort of a knitting back together within your family to deal with these issues?
Really good question. Yes is the short answer, but ironically more with my mom. My dad, for various reasons, so my parents divorced when I was about 25, and my dad, who had always been very dismissive of therapy, I talk in the book about how he would talk about how my sister and I had to go to our wacko lessons. And he was a physician, and he thought, he just had, he couldn't tolerate weakness. He thought, psychiatric disorders are like hardcore things like psychotic schizophrenia. So he was not, growing up, he was not the most supportive. And as you say, he sort of would, because of sleep deprivation and my screaming, sort of get overwhelmed and become physically abusive. But he was, much more than my mother was. Again, he's on the Jewish side as opposed to the WASP repressive side. Very encouraging about writing the book. There was a brief moment where we sort of had some back and forth about what I could actually put in the book as I was publishing it. But my relationship with my dad is now better than it's ever been. We have a great relationship. We talk all the time. I think publishing the book has been incredibly healing and therapeutic for both of us, and he's very candid about the ways he mishandled. He sort of didn't know how to handle my anxiety. My mom, again, coming from the WASP perspective, was, oh my God, you've brought permanent dishonor on the family. This is terribly embarrassing. And yet, so when the book ended up in the New York Times bestseller list, she was like very excited, but at the same time, she didn't want anyone to read it because it had all kinds of embarrassing things about her. So I wouldn't say that the healing with my mom has quite gone to the same level as it has with my dad. But overall, it's a positive thing. So.
Okay, last question. I saw that hand first.
Hopefully related exactly to what you were saying there. With all that you're doing, all of the insight, the therapy, you're candor about the drugs at the beginning. With all of that, is there a sense of aging out of this? Do you have a general sense that at whatever age you are now, regardless of all that, I'm a little bit better than I was 10 years ago, and I guess relating to all of the research and the insight that you've done in that regard. I mean, is there a scenario where there is no aging out and you can die from intense anxiety, or is there some way that you just somewhat naturally it becomes a little bit less onerous?
No, thank you for that question. I mean, I think that for me, again, the experience of publishing the book and again doing these sort of protracted exposure therapy has been helpful and sort of moving me a little bit beyond and as I say, sort of relieving the burden of having to hide and do what Dr. W, my therapist in the book, calls impression management. Hiding the anxiety. The clinical research evidence on there actually is some evidence that people as they get through middle age in general just get their alignment of expectations, and maybe partly it's actually neurological changes in the brain make you you kind of give up. You realize you're not going to be the quarterback for the Patriots or the pitcher for the Yankees or the great American novelist. And there's this phenomenon called the U curve, happiness on the U curve, where if you ask 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, are you going to be happier or unhappier in 10 years? They all say, I'm going to be much happier. Life's just going to get awesomer and awesomer. And of course, then they get into middle age and it's not, and so they're depressed. And I mean, this is where the midlife crisis comes from. Whereas if you ask 55-year-olds, looking ahead to 65, is your life going to be better or worse? They say, oh, worse, because my decrepitude is just going to increase. And then they get to 65 and they're like, actually, I'm still alive. This isn't so bad. So there's a lot of like physiological and psychological evidence that just it becomes easier to accept yourself and be happy with what you have. There is evidence about to some degree, people in their 70s, 80s do develop greater levels of anxiety. But I hope that I can age out of it to some degree, and to some degree I think I have.
The through line through the book from the time you're a child up until this book being published is that you just feel like you're on the precipice of failure. And you're going back and forth in the last pages with Dr. W. And he goes, but Scott, you've already published a book. You're providing for a family. You've done all these things. Give yourself some credit. Are you able at this point to give yourself some credit?
Better than I was before, and this actually relates to a question somebody, either you or asked earlier. Psychopathology can be an incredibly motivating factor. Like Richard Nixon was incredibly fucked up and miserable, but I think and he was not a very good president, but it made him president because he had this incredibly driving. I think the more we can get away from that, the better off we are. And yeah, no, I do think that I've started to try to take more of that to heart and realize that I'm, as Dr. W always says, for all my struggles and intermittent sort of mini breakdowns, I'm more resilient than I know, and I'm becoming more aware of that, which has been very, very helpful. So,
well, I've enjoyed talking to you and listening
likewise,
to you.
Thank you so much.
I hope that you guys have as well. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much.
So is there anything you want to tell everybody before? Okay, signing books upstairs.